Thank you very much indeed, Mark. It's great to see everybody here again. It's great not to have to schlep all the way up to Celtic Manor, as lovely as it was presenting in the hotel from The Shining. Around this time last year, Mark introduced me up on stage as the man who puts anal into analysis. And I took that personally. Not just as a silly little joke, but I took that as a challenge. That this year, we are going to get more data, more charts, more stats, more analysis into this presentation than ever before. Because when, hopefully when I can click through my slides, when the market, when the whole of the UK has been going up and down more like a roller coaster than a typical market, where we've seen political turmoil, when we've seen economic uncertainty, now more than ever, we need the best data and insight to guide all of our decisions. Mark referenced this earlier. We often say, as a bit of a hackneyed phrase, a week is a long time in politics. There has been no longer week than the one we experienced at the start of this month. In the space of just a few short days, we saw the departure of Her late Majesty the Queen and the accession to the throne of her son, King Charles, a man that we know has extremely strong and well-expressed views on development, design, and architecture. We also saw change in the less lofty spheres of politics as well. This man, Mr. Zahawi, handing over the keys of number 11 Downing Street to Mr. Kwarteng here, a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, bringing with him new priorities, new focuses, and potentially a new approach to who gets taxed and who gets the stimulus and potential impacts there for the residential market. And of course, who could forget, it's not so long now since we saw the departure of our Eurofighter joyrider-in-chief, Boris Johnson, and his replacement by the awkwardly curtsying Prime Minister Liz Truss. A woman who has made it very clear on her campaign trail that she's got mixed views on development, whether that's her opposition to Stalinist housing delivery targets. I suspect there's a few people in here who quite like Stalinist housing delivery targets, then we might actually stand a chance of meeting them. But also opposition to nutrient neutrality, a mixed bag, as we will see as we come later through the presentation. But, you know, as a result of that, we've seen more change in the political sphere over that week than the change in my wardrobe as we first entered lockdown. And it's to that I'd like you to cast your minds back, not to my wardrobe, but to that first few days of lockdown. Because while it seems like a lifetime ago, it's in fact not very long at all since the market was looking a little bit like this. Slight relief, perhaps slight additional level of certainty as we saw the result of that 2019 general election, a stonking majority for the Conservatives, which, regardless of which political stripes you have, at least gave us a bit more certainty about where future policy direction was going to take us. But at that time, the housing market was not having a great time. In terms of residential values, just as a sort of general barometer of housing market health, we saw values falling across many parts of the country, and where we did see growth, that growth was looking pretty anemic. And as we saw those first lockdowns announced, and as we saw the housing market shut down, things were looking very ropey indeed. Riding into the rescue came Rishi Sunak. In many ways, the stamp duty holiday was a bit like Eat Out to Help Out. Rather than everybody diving for 4 starters and really going completely hog wild, we saw many residential buyers doing that classic British thing of paying an additional 3% above asking price to save 1% in tax. Even as we withdrew that stimulus and the market looks like it may be set to take a bit of a breather, we saw that growth sustained. That stamp duty holiday was merely the tinder to start that fire. The rest of that fuel provided by low mortgage interest rates, readily available mortgage debt as we came out of the pandemic, and that persistent race for space, people repositioning themselves, reprioritizing their housing, given that they were spending a lot more time over those last few years at home than they had previously anticipated. So now, without that stamp duty stimulus, we're seeing price growth at record levels. Land Registry, their last price growth figures show UK house price growth at 15.5%. In the southwest, the fastest growing region, we saw growth in excess of 20% year on year. And there's questions there, as Mark suggested in the title of this talk, about whether we're in for a rude awakening. Can this be sustained, or is the tide, in fact, starting to turn? Well, if you look at what estate agents are saying, and I would recommend that you only do this very rarely, estate agents seem to be pointing in the direction of a cooling market. This chart really shows the extent of what Savills research can do, so please do bear with me just a second. We have, in the blue line here, a measure of demand, the number of new buyers coming in through estate agent doors. If the line is above 0, those numbers are increasing. If it's below, those numbers are decreasing. Then there's the orange line, supply, new instructions onto the market. And again, same, above, increasing, below, decreasing. And the groundbreaking analysis that we've done here, the real cutting-edge stuff, we've taken one of those lines and we've subtracted it from the other. That gives us those yellow bars. And you can see there for the last 4 months, we've moved from that environment of demand exceeding supply, of positive pressure on price growth, pushing those values ever higher, to a market where demand is falling away and the amount of supply into the market is declining, but at a much slower pace. And as a result of that, we do expect to see some easing off in transaction activity over the coming months and potentially some easing off of price growth as well. What's triggered all of this? Well, a lot of it appears to be the Bank of England. Over the last few months, the Monetary Policy Committee has really doubled down in its efforts to fight inflation, and we have seen interest rate rise after interest rate rise as they try and get a better handle on things. Even discussion that later this week that we may see them increase the base rate by as much as 75 basis points, not to be outdone by what's going on over at the Fed. As a result of that, we're seeing mortgage rates across the board increase dramatically. And that's the same regardless of whether you're borrowing with a large deposit or a small one. Back during the pandemic, if you were borrowing with a large deposit, generally things were looking pretty good. Banks were taking a view that if, smaller deposit, higher loan to value stuff, that was the risky stuff. That's where we're going to jack the prices up. But if you're borrowing with a massive deposit, if you're a home mover with loads of equity, that can still go ahead. That picture has changed very dramatically, and those home movers are going to find it much more difficult to secure mortgage rates at the low levels with which they have become comfortable over the last decade. Putting the increase in rates there into pounds, shillings, and pence, if you were to take the same home, that £300,000 home, 25% deposit, if you were to get a mortgage on those terms a year ago, back in August of 2021, you would be paying around 1.2% in interest. You would be paying £1,162 per month on your mortgage repayments. Fast forward 12 months, that interest rate has trebled. That's quite a hefty increase. And as a result of that, even accounting for the fact that part of your repayments are going back onto the principal, your overall repayments, your monthly outgoings have gone up by 31% to more than £1,500 a month on that same valued property. Add on to that spiraling energy bills, add on to that the general pressure we're seeing on the cost of living crisis, and you can see there that for new buyers at least, for people accessing home ownership, for people who are getting mortgages, that makes the market look a lot less easy than it was maybe 12 months ago. For a variety of reasons, however, we don't believe that this is cause for widespread panic, and there's 2 reasons for that. The first is that for existing homeowners at least, the vast majority of them have nailed down their interest rates on fixed rate deals. In the latest data that we have from the Bank of England, in Q2 of this year, more than 95% of mortgage lending was at fixed rates. That brings the total outstanding mortgage book to 85% of that mortgage book being on fixed rates. If you compare that back to 2014, around when we were introducing mortgage market review, when we were last looking at such things, then around half that level were at fixed rates, 42%. So the market has changed very dramatically. Those mortgage borrowers are insulated to some degree from what we're seeing happening to interest rates. On the other side, reason 2, there is the broad expectation that this is a peak that we're going to pass, and as quickly as we see interest rates rise, we will see them come back down again. And indeed, if you look at the expectations for inflation from the Bank of England, you can see there that regardless of the increases that we've seen in those forecasts over the last few months, the expectation is still that we see inflation peak relatively soon and start to come back down again. That will give the bank the capacity to reduce those rates in future months and years. Since we've seen that intervention from Liz Truss, we've yet to see the detail on that, but the energy bill price cap that we've seen proposed by the new Prime Minister suggests that inflation level may well peak at far lower levels than we're seeing here, closer to 10% than the 18 to 22% figures we were seeing forecast by some of the American banks earlier in the month. So with that, clearly it's been a bit of a roller coaster. The picture has been changing. Can you imagine? There was a time at which Savills Research only used to produce their forecasts once a year. I mean, obviously, life has got a lot harder for us since, but it's been a lot easier to justify our paychecks. Most recently, we forecast in August. These are the figures that we put out. The formatting has gone somewhat awry, so please do forgive me. We've had to change those figures already, and very rapidly that picture is changing. And while we do not yet have, that's much better, while we do not yet have the full picture on where those numbers are likely to sit, come back in November for those numbers, we can give an indication of the direction of travel. And so in the short term, with that cost of living pressure, with those higher interest rates, we can expect to see a more negative environment, a more bearish environment for house price growth and for transaction activity, but for greater capacity for further growth further down the line as we see that interest rate environment normalize and as we see the impact of that relaxed mortgage regulation. Now, Lawrence, I hear some of you saying to me, particularly the people in here who are particularly fond of the rental sector, this doesn't apply to me. I'm just going to ignore the housing market. I'm going to ignore the sales market. I'm going to pack all that for a game of soldiers. I'm going to go rent instead. And unfortunately, just about everyone else has had the same idea. We've seen a dramatic increase in rental demand, far in excess of levels of supply, and particularly in urban areas. People moving back out of their parents' houses, moving back into urban areas, back into cities, so as the expectation to return to the office starts to gather some momentum. And at the same time, you've got a whole bunch of landlords who've looked at the policy environment. They have to meet higher energy efficiency requirements. They have to meet decent home standards. They have to give their tenants more rights. And they have made the perhaps slightly questionable decision to say, stuff all that, I'm going to sell up and take all my capital gains, thank you very much. And so with that, we've seen reduced levels of rental supply, increased level of demand, and very rapidly rising rental values as the many tenants who are left scrabble to fight for the last few rental properties available. Rents rose 12.3% across the UK in the 12 months to July of this year, according to Zoopla. They rose by 18% in London. Ask anyone you know who's renting in London at the moment, anyone who's looking for a property, be it your friends, your family, your kids, your employees, whatever, they will all tell you renting in London right now is not a fun time. And that is, in one way it's a tragedy, but in another it's an opportunity, and it demonstrates the value, the opportunity to deliver more well-managed, professionally designed and purpose-built homes for the rental market. We have indeed seen that proportion of those homes, the number of those homes being delivered, accelerating rapidly over the last few years. There are now 74,000 purpose-built, built-to-rent homes across the UK, and crucially that pipeline is expanding not just in that operational stock, but also across those homes that have secured planning. And that's crucial because it shows that planning authorities, who are in the best possible way, one of the major obstacles to delivering more homes, are becoming more familiar with build-to-rent. They're becoming more familiar with the concept of building homes specifically to rent and not building them for sale to buy-to-let landlords who will then rent them out anyway. With all of that, we have to take a moment to appreciate that this is still very early days for that build-to-rent sector. There are 73,000 built-to-rent homes. There are around 4.5–5 million private rented sector homes across the UK. And as a result, there is plenty of opportunities here, a huge opportunity for that sector to grow its share, and to grow its share particularly of new housing supply. The opportunity for that may well be coming up very shortly. We've seen many changes to government policy on house building, on home ownership over the last few years. One of the most major ones, one of the ones that's triggered the most reluctance, the most disbelief, arguably, from developers, is the withdrawal of support for Help to Buy. As recently as Q1 of 2021, we saw Help to Buy supporting 25% of all new dwelling completions. In the latest figures for the year to Q1 of this year, we've seen that figure to fall to below 14%, to the lowest it's been since the scheme began. And with that, house builders have a gap to fill. House builders have to figure out alternative routes to market, and they will have to get creative if they want to maintain and expand their levels of delivery. Part of that will be through build to rent. It will be partnering with people like Cortland, people like Moda, people like Sigma to deliver more purpose-built homes for rent. But also it will be about finding alternative routes to market to replace those that are being taken away. That may be through first homes, albeit that some of the homes there will be coming out of developer Section 106 contributions. It may be through deposit unlock, and it may, to some degree, be through an additional supply of affordable housing, taking advantage of the government's affordable home programme and engaging in new partnerships with housing associations or with for-profit registered providers. Fundamentally, though, developers will have to get more creative, and that includes looking at those underserved demographics, those demographics for whom the housing market hasn't really worked previously. A lot of that is delivering more affordable housing, but a lot of that is also dealing with the demands, the needs of other underserved groups. People like older people who need homes that are flexible, that will help them as they age and as they need additional levels of care and support. People like younger people who aren't ready to put down roots yet, but want a home that facilitates community and sharing and friendship, rather than exclusively giving them a roof over their heads and a door they can lock. However, there is a risk with all of this. And the risk is that we just see that gap not filled, and we see housing supply fall off as a result of what's going on in the planning business at the moment. This map shows you what's going on in terms of nutrient neutrality. It shows those local planning authorities that have had planning either disrupted or put on hold entirely because of rules regarding nitrates and phosphates causing issues with our watercourses. And if you overlay that with a map showing those local authorities where supply is most constrained, where the number of new planning consents isn't meeting the pace of delivery, you can see a suspicious overlap. Those areas such as the Solent, the Cotswolds, Cheshire, where there are areas where there are significant issues with nutrient neutrality, they're also facing very significant issues of planning consents being built out, and there's no new consents there to replace them. As a result of that, plus the 12 or so local planning authorities that have just either paused or halted their planned development process because there is just too much uncertainty from central government policy at the moment, and you have the perfect storm. We've seen planning consents fall below 300,000 consents per year again, which means any hopes of getting to that 300,000 homes per year delivery target look like they may be a very long way off indeed. And a lot of that issue, a lot of that difficulty with the planning system seems to come from a misalignment, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication of what development is there to do, what it's there to pay for. And to illustrate some of this confusion, some of this mismatch, I've got an indicative chart of what may be going on here. Please do take this as an indication. Don't get your rulers out. This is not meant to be an accurate or a precise representation of how things work. But very, very broadly speaking, each site can support a certain amount of value, a certain amount of gross development value, or GDV. Of that, you've got to find a way of splitting that out. Some of that will be profit to the developer. They can't expect to do this for free. They're going to have to get something to get them out of bed in the morning. Another chunk will go on to developer contributions, things like Section 106, SIL, paying for affordable housing, for new schools, for road junctions, for infrastructure, and so on. Build costs take up a significant chunk, and then of course there's the amount left over, the residual land value, that mysterious figure that encourages a landowner to part with their hard-earned pony paddock or former office or whatever it happens to be in order to facilitate that development. Things now look a little bit more complex. That developer still wants to make a profit. That's not going to change anytime soon. But the expectations for what development is supposed to pay for have changed very dramatically. Section 106 expectations from local authorities are as high as they've ever been. We've gone from a situation where Section 106 funded 9% of affordable housing completions 10 years ago to the most recent figures where it funded 53% of all new affordable housing. We are far more reliant on the ability of developers to support that housing supply than ever before, far less reliant on government just giving grant funding than ever before. Build costs have not gone down. In fact, they've gone up quite significantly if you look at what's going on with build cost inflation. But on top of that, you've got the additional costs now of building to a higher standard, whether that's through Part L building regulations or meeting at some stage in the future home standard. Then you've got the cost of matching your biodiversity net gain mitigation requirements. In some cases, you're having to mitigate the impacts that you're having on local nutrient levels. And of course, the landowner still wants their cut. They still want enough money to justify going with you, the residential developer, and not with somebody who's going to throw up a shed and let it to Amazon. They want to justify giving it to you and not just keeping it in its current use as farmland or an office or whatever it happens to be. Now, you do not need to be a graph expert to see that there is something wrong here. We are adding up to well over 100%, and unless people's expectations change, then they are going to end up extremely disappointed when these plans impact with reality. And what tends to happen looks a little bit like this. You see some erosion in land value, but you can't cut that down too much, because otherwise the site will go to a competing use. You see some erosion in developer profit, but you can't see too much, because otherwise banks won't lend to them, they can't get the sign-off from their shareholders, they can't afford to make the site work, and therefore what tends to get squeezed most significantly is those Section 106 contributions. And until we are able to communicate that argument better, until we can make that viability argument clearer, we are going to see continued pressure, continued negative feedback from planners, and continued difficulty securing planning consents wherever we are in the country. Now, with that incredibly hairy and intractable problem, and the other challenges that the sector faces, climate neutrality, dealing with building safety, you can imagine at this point, now more than ever, we need strong, stable, long-term guidance and stewardship of the sector. And so it is a shame that we keep on chopping and changing housing ministers more often than Henry VIII changes his wives. Mark, I've got a scoop for you. We are now on to, not only are we on to 8 housing ministers in the last 5 years, the man on the bottom right here, Marcus Jones, is no longer housing minister. He handed in his resignation after just 62 days. Now, if I put that into context, we were in lockdown in 2020 longer than that. So he's clearly less able to submit to those, the onerous task of being housing minister than we were to staying at home all the time. To help remind you of what's happened to the sort of mixed fortunes of these different housing ministers of state for housing, I thought it might be useful to borrow something from the Henry VIII sort of primary school education system. You remember with the wives, you can remember what happened to them by that little rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a bit trickier with housing ministers. It's more like defeated, reshuffled, promoted, reshuffled, reshuffled, beheaded, reshuffled, resigned, which is slightly clunkier. But I think by the time we get around to dinner, it will have caught on. No, so now, with all of this change afoot, we have these 2 gentlemen in charge. The bottom left there is, as Mark pointed out earlier, this is Simon Clarke, our new Secretary of State for Levelling Up Communities and Housing. And on top there, we've got Lee Rowley, who I believe, at least unofficially and possibly officially, is now our new Minister of State for Housing. It's still very early days yet. In fact, I'm not even sure if they've done the official Downing Street tweet to announce that Lee Rowley is in place. But assuming that he is, it's still too early, far too early to tell what the policy direction coming out of them may be. But we can get some clues. We can take some analysis. We can take the direction that we're seeing from other parts of government to indicate where things may be going. The first of those is the new focus from Treasury. I can just imagine Rishi Sunak sort of reading the FT, saying Kwasi Kwarteng has decided all we need to do is just increase economic growth to 2.5%. And Rishi going, I wish I'd thought of that. Would have been so much easier. No, Treasury now viewing everything through a growth lens and looking to accelerate economic growth across the UK. And as a result of that, we can expect to see positive things for the sector. Why? Because house building is one of the surest-fire ways to increase economic growth. It has had a very well-established and very well-documented positive impact on GDP growth. It does also mean we may see less of a focus on levelling up. More focus on just the volume, the quantum of growth, and less on the location and the redistribution of that growth. But, of course, we do also have to deal with promises made during various election and leadership campaigns. We do still expect to see the Renters Reform Bill pushed through Parliament, which will have an impact for the private rented sector. We do still expect to see pressure on house builders through building safety charges and levies. And of course, based on the Liz Truss's campaign, we have that mixed picture, the removal of those Stalinist housing delivery targets and potentially some easing off of those planning regulations on nutrient neutrality, which, depending on how fond you are of fish, may be a good or a bad thing. Now, these are all very difficult issues, and there's a lot here for us all to chew on as we go through our next panel session and the rest of the day. So before I hand over to our illustrious panel of CEOs, I'm going to leave you with a few parting summary thoughts. First of all, as we mentioned, the Bank of England is already raising rates significantly in its battle to combat inflation. And that has an impact for all of us, whether we are developers who are using debt finance, that's increasing our costs, but particularly for those operating in the sales market, it increases difficulties for people who are trying to get access to mortgage debt, offset to some degree by some relaxation of those rules in the coming years. For the rental market, their demand far outstrips supply, putting huge pressure on rental values and supporting very high levels of growth. But meeting that demand, increasing supply will be difficult with the difficulties that we're seeing in the planning system. Whether you call that uncertainty or just a sheer unwillingness to work with the sector, things are getting very difficult indeed. And of course, on top of all of that, it is going to be very difficult to deal with all of these problems, with the planning difficulties we're facing, with the challenge of hitting net zero carbon, with the challenge of making sure that all buildings that we construct are safe for all our residents. Doing all of that is going to be very difficult indeed without secure, stable, long-term leadership for the residential sector. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But one thing we can be very certain about is that the next few years will give us just as many loop-the-loops and twists and turns as we've seen over the last few. Thank you very much indeed.